Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings, and might add the salutations in there. And also, we like to add another plus sign to that. And what do we add? We add a welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty, and I'm joined by the Marvel, the Marvelous, the Magnificent, the Mysterious. We add it all together to equal Russ. How's it going?
How's it going today? Happy Monday.
Yes, happy Monday indeed. And I would also say, if this is your first time joining, allow us to reintroduce ourselves. So I am Tristan Watty. I come to you from the AWS Professional Services team, specifically in the security area, where we help to accelerate customers' journeys to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form. And I am also joined by Russ. And Russ, where do you come from?
I come from the customer incident response team, where we help contain, mitigate, and get you back to baseline for any of your security or incident needs.
Yes. And I would say every trip to Russ is a fun trip because you get to speak with Russ, but try not to go to Russ. In general, right? It's like go to Russ if you want to talk about fun stuff like where you're tuning into this show from, which we also like to ask every episode along with other questions. But feel free to put this one in the chat if you fancy that.
Yeah, but, and if you want to talk to me without the entire security incident, feel free to like and comment and subscribe and talk to all of our social medias and stuff. That will be a place where you can contact me without it being a full-blown incident.
Yes.
But exactly. If you do have a full-blown incident, please feel free to reach out.
Exactly. 100% to that. And if you want to answer another question that's not so where you're from, we have one that requires a little bit of reading, but it is an interesting one nonetheless. So this question is, would you rather have every gaming console ever made, but only one game per console, or have only one console, but every game ever made for it? I would say this is an interesting thing, as well as saying hello as always to Ari and dialing from the UK, LOLs, Pete from Georgia, and Schizo comes in with the first answer. One console, every game. Nice. Russ, where do you go with this question?
I think this would depend on the limitations. If we're talking about console, I'm assuming that means PC doesn't count, so I can't have every game on PC. So I think that I would have to go every console ever made, so long as that includes future consoles as well.
Yes, you gotta prepare for the future with that one, and that'd be interesting if you say, okay, if I choose PC as the console every game, then you're like, okay, which loader do I pick?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
But basically.
Yeah, and it's interesting. For me, I would go with every game for one console.
Ooh,
and
what console?
Yeah, then you say what console. So my mind goes to either PS1 or PS2.
Interesting.
I think PS2, the library would keep you busy for a long period of time.
I was about to say, I think 2 has a bigger library than 1, so...
Yeah, and a little bit better graphics, just a tad bit, right? I can deal with blocks, I can deal with 8-bit and pixels, but is that all I get to deal with? So, there's things. And Pete says, let me run this by LLM. Yeah. And then Ari says, I think I would go with every game for one console, but that's the completionist in Ari. Yeah, I completely understand that.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think the next point or fashion is to dive into today's episode. So I would say the best way to transition to this is, Russ, where are we coming from? Where do we go? And yeah, I would finish that statement, but it'll go into a song.
I was about to finish it for you. So last week was a new challenger approaches, requests denied, AWS WAF fundamentals. This week, we're going to stay along that same trajectory. Don't worry if you missed last week, you can still follow along with what we're going to go over today, which is our AWS WAF solutions, titled One Rule to Block Them All. And hopefully you get that reference. It's a big one, an obvious one. But today we'll go over a little bit more about WAF solutions and integration, and of course more about rules again. We went over that last week, but it's such a critical part of WAF that of course we're going to talk about it again this week.
Yeah, and I think that's the important part is when you're starting to break things down, you kind of have to have understanding. Last week, we went into the fundamentals of what WAF is, kind of at its core level. Now, you have to kind of forge what you've known, no pun intended, or a little bit of a pun intended, right? So, can you forge one rule to rule them all? Interesting question. So, we'll get into that because if you think of what we learned from the fundamentals, there's a lot of comprehensive rules that WAF can kind of handle, and there's different security concerns that it can address, and there's ways to craft said rules in a well-optimized manner, fashion, and form. But if you were to go down the fellowship of the rules path, 10 points if you see where we're going with all these references, that's where you start to think of, okay, can WAF rules work together in harmony as part of a cohesive strategy of the security variety? So we're talking about rule grouping, rule ordering, rule priorities, and maybe how to create logical relationships, right? So some Boolean logic is involved in there, but you like to have a little bit of fun while you're doing this. So as Pete says, sounds like threat protection fun. Deny all, right? That's the rule. Just deny all. What are you going to accept? Nothing. Yeah, that's a good start. So if we follow that, we can start to think about how those services integrate. Now you're starting to delve into not just WAF, but things that connect to WAF, like CloudFront, ALBs, API gateways, so on and so forth, Cognito. All these items come together to kind of define your realm, right? Because you say your AWS environment, we'll use realm today because it seems to go with the theme.
Yeah.
And then how do you protect your realm? Well, you have to know what's happening within your realm. So you have to discuss the monitoring, logging, and the response capabilities. And when you start to break things down to that nature, now if you do a deny all, you can get all the logs that you want from it, but they'll all be denied. I think the other way to look at this is kind of starting with the basics, the fundamentals that is often skipped. And it's not a technical item. It's more of a personnel, a governance description. And that's where we have this question to pose to the audience. And that is, who manages WAF in your fellowship? Is it your security team, your DevOps team, your platform team? Or is it a solo question because it's just you? So feel free to put in the chat 1, 2, 3, or 4. So, Russ, which way do you go with this?
So I would go with the security team, ideally, but I've seen that DevOps teams, which are used to that sort of firewall type of function. So I've seen that too, but I'd prefer to keep it the security team, keep it all under one. So that way they're still ingesting logs and regularly, routinely going over and auditing. So that's what I would prefer. And I'd also like to say preferably not number 4. Unless you're like in a smaller startup type of situation, then maybe that'll happen. But for the most part.
Yes. That's where the deny all statement comes in, right?
It's just me, deny everything.
And I think it's an interesting thing because the security team ideally would be the most common approach and kind of the pattern most organizations take. But you often see, or you can also see from different customers, some of the platform ownership starting to come into play where the security team kind of drives the governance side and kind of what you adhere to. And then you might have the platform team kind of implementing that with the cloud native approaches and things of that nature. So since the platform team is managing the infrastructure, they spin up the WAF and they have the Terraform or the cloud formation and stuff like that. And the security team is saying, here's the rules that you need to implement. based on this. So
I was just going to get into that. Once you start adding like the Terraform templating and stuff like that, that's when it starts to usually get a little bit away from the security team.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other item is you might have all three come into play, where you have the security for the governance, you have the platform for the infrastructure, and DevOps is doing the implementation side of it. Kind of what Pete is saying in the chat, maturity level of the security team has a massive impact. And 10 points to Pete on that one, because that's a big factor. Because sometimes the security team, they might be, let's say, new to the AWS environment. So components of that is, hey, we know what our on-prem security state is, but when it comes to the AWS cloud, we might be a little bit more younger in our overall cloud journey. So they try to kind of adapt that, where you may have had the infrastructure or the platform team or the DevOps team more familiar with deploying mechanisms via their pipelines, right, for whatever they're using.
Yep.
And I think part of that governance starts to get into that, can we just forge the one rule, rule them all? And I think that's where part of the design strategy comes into place, right? Because when you think of, okay, if we have and take our deny all rule, if we put that first, what's going to happen? We're going to deny all. So if we pull that back a little bit, there's a hierarchy that rule evaluation happens on. So implementing the precise evaluation order using, your numerical order from 0 to whatever, it ensures the critical blocks are in place, but you also want to make sure that you have the correct logic down for this. Because what we've seen with certain customers as they start to mature in their journey is, hey, we want to implement these rules. Like, okay, maybe we can condense this and remove these duplicates. Because sometimes if you're coming from that mentality of, oh, I have this application that does this and I have this application that does that, but there's some overlap there, they don't evaluate all the rules holistically. They evaluate it based on the application. And sometimes what happens is you have duplicates, you have layers to it, right? It's like ogres with onions, it has layers. If you get that reference, thank you. Because the age is showing in the references sometimes. But
I'm an ogre.
I appreciate that so much. So as we start to go through the rule actioning sequence, this is where you start to get into the strategy aspect, right? Your counts, your block progression, things of that nature. Because sometimes you may have a rule in place that, hey, just count. Don't necessarily block. Maybe for evaluation and maybe for auditing purposes, or maybe you're trying to evaluate your overall flow of what's happening from the networking perspective, right? Because when you start to dive in and mature your levels in your cloud, you may not have a holistic idea of what's happening here, because I have a minimum security baseline, but in order to optimize and tune that, you have to look at logs, you have to look at all these different metrics. So I don't know from your side, Russ, when it comes to, let's say, false positives, how do you feel that comes into play when you're looking at like rules as a whole?
Yes. So that does come into play, not only from the false positive perspective of like alert fatigue and all of that, but also just when you're looking at rules, especially like when you're looking at the prioritization of rules, when you start having overlaps, or say, for example, maybe you have a certain rule that's a higher priority in one application, but isn't as high a priority in another application. You can start to see these at different priorities still going either off, and then you seem to have a higher priority issue than what you actually do, because in one application, it's not quite as important as in another application. So that could lead you to believe that there's maybe an incident or some sort of security event that is at a higher priority than it is. I've seen that. And I've also seen some cases where it causes a lot of performance issues, especially if the application is doing something intense like video, and so can actually significantly impact that performance, which could also cause a delay or an outage, and you'd basically be denial of service DOSing yourself. So yeah, those are definitely some things that you have to keep in consideration and go along when you're hopefully doing an audit of your WAF rules.
Yeah, and that's a real important part, is that latency, right? Because you can see probably a 40 to 60% reduction in latency just by having your rules optimized, right? Because you gotta imagine that you're funneling everything through a pipe, if we use that analogy. And the more gates and tolls that you're putting into place that overlap, then it just adds a little millisecond here, millisecond here, millisecond here, and it adds up, right? And for things like, hey, what we're doing now from the live interwebs is very important to reduce the latency where you can by optimizing those kind of things. And Pete also has a good point, loves to set count, but don't forget to come back and actually block stuff. Yes.
It's a great point.
Make sure there are tickets of your favorite ticketing system variety in place to make sure that, like, hey, we did the count, but now we actually have to block. Somebody has to do the documentation and all that good stuff. And you also mentioned a great point about kind of DDoSing yourself. And that goes down or comes back to, what kind of rate limiting techniques do you have? How do you protect yourself against something like a brute force attack or something along those lines, right? So in your optimization, you want to make sure that you implement certain rate limits and things of that nature, right? Because there's multiple factors. You could do the IP, the URI, things of that nature, but you can go down some rabbit holes and tangents with that. But
yeah,
the main point is to make sure that you take away that, hey, you have to optimize these rule sets based on your environment. So you can have custom header tracking. You can have some type of, let's say, mechanism in order to just contain your costs as well. I think that's a main thing that, doesn't get considered sometimes in the appropriate light. And what I mean by that is, hey, we want to reduce costs. But how do you reduce costs? By understanding what you're trying to achieve, what are your outcomes, things of that nature, and then implementing the correct structure to it. Sometimes when you jump ahead, you end up costing yourself more just because you have to either go back and change, or you pay for it in something like the latency, things like that we mentioned. And Schizo says, we have DDoS and denial of wallet for serverless applications. Denial of wallet.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one, right? Mm-hmm. So when you start to think about this, I think part of that comes into your attack surface reduction. If we were to kind of boil it down to a couple of things, right? So if you take something like rate limiting, reducing your overall attack surface is key to your overall success. And I think another part of this, if I were to go off on a tangent, is starting to think of, hey, what is your overall, let's say, reputation from an IP perspective? Because usually if you have bots or something like that, there's, hey, your reputation when it comes to externally facing items. So what is your overall preventative measures that keep your reputation high when it comes to the internet and how you're serving up traffic and things of that nature? So items that you can go to, you can think about, you can delve into, but the important part is you have your rate limiting, you understand your cost factors, and you understand kind of what rules you're building for your application and making sure those rules don't overlap. Mm-hmm. So I think the important part of that is the why. The why is you're reducing your false positives, because now you understand the rules and how they're being evaluated within your environment. And the most important part is, hey, technical debt prevention. Try and strive and build that into your plans, because we hear a lot of customers say, oh, we'll come back to that. Or, this is something for Q1 next year or Q4 the following year. And that gets pushed to the next year and the next year and next year. And then all of that tech that builds up until, hey, how do we fix this? And it becomes a larger.
And then you're coming to see me.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we're going to have to fix your tech debt under a very stressful situation. Circumstance.
Exactly. Because I can imagine where it's, hey, we're getting DDoSed a lot. Can you help us with this? And then that conversation comes like, all right, what are your rules? And then you see the rules. And if we're using the realm approach, it's kind of a scroll at that point, right? It's not one rule to rule them all. It's more of like 10 rules to do the same thing. And then, so that can affect. And Pete says mainframe problem. that's the tech debt of legend right there, right? The mainframe. What?
Yep.
I guess
one of the again.
Yeah. One of the other pieces, if we were to keep the same mentality going, is we have maybe one rule to rule them all, but we'll take that concept for optimization purposes. Now, if we have the fellowship of the rules, how do we think about rules, Russ? Do we think of managed rules, custom rules, something in between? How do we put together the sandwich?
Yeah, so that's kind of, if we're discussing our fellowship, that is a definite one of your first concerns, I'd say, when you're building out your rule list. You could build out your one rule, and really have it, either a deny all or the world's largest nested WAF rule. You could do it that way. But there is definitely a bunch of strategy and thought that goes behind the rule set. So, taking the AWS managed rule set, that's going to be your base level WAF rules. So it'll hit your commonly used attacks like I can't even think of the
OWASP top 10.
Yeah, OWASP top 10. I was like, wow, I can't even come up with the
deny rule at all.
So basically, it's going to be your most common web threats. That will be used to protect your application. But AWS managed rules are purpose built to add that base layer of security to your applications using the WAF rule set, but it's not supposed to be intended instead of building WAF rules, because that's the AWS managed rule set is very, I don't want to say generic, but it's not custom built for what you're looking to do and what you're trying to protect. So it does the basics to be able to have something in addition to what your basic rules will be. So, for example, it'll have some rules like, protecting with cross-site scripting or SQL injection, or it'll have something where you can block any HTTP request that doesn't have a user agent. Stuff like that, where it'll be pretty basic, generic, protect me from, most things. But where you want to focus is going to be on what those don't cover. So your specific architecture or environment, what you're looking to do, what kind of app you're hosting. So all of that is what you need to take into consideration for that. So the managed rules are good, but aren't the only thing that you should be using. So you should always supplement the managed rules list with your own custom rules. So ideally, you would do that as quickly as possible and not, like you said earlier, add that to the tech debt where you're like, oh, we'll do that. That's an interesting question. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think this goes to that same item of, can we block VPN users with AWS WAF? I would say yes, just for the fact of there's a couple of different ways, but it depends on what type of VPN user. Are you talking about your own VPN users, people VPNing out? there's a couple of considerations, because my mind goes to, okay, you could do geographical restrictions with VPN traffic. You can do a bot control group, which I think is one of your questions. Can it block bots? Yes.
Yep.
So that's another piece that you can have. So it's the holistic approach of what you're trying to do when you block a VPN user, but overall there's ways to do it, right? You just need to know what you're trying to block. So thank you for that question. And back to you, Russ.
Yeah, and that goes exactly into it. That's not going to be your common AWS managed rule set. That won't be in there. So if you do have a problem with bots, especially if they're, doing some scanning and some harvesting, then that's something that you would want to add specifically for your WAF rule set to protect your application. And so that's definitely something that you should kind of keep in the back of your mind. But then also, because I don't think that that it's talked enough about, but for cost optimization, when you're looking at rules, it can be, I'd say, enticing to just say, whatever, AWS has managed rules, we're good. But you want to dig a little bit deeper than that, creating your own custom rules, but also choosing rules based off of in the priority list. You can order that based off of cost. So you can put cheaper, more efficient rules at a higher priority. And so that way they'll block out some of these on basically cheaper rules than, getting into the complex, the world's largest nested rule strategy, something instead of that, creating that sort of thing. That way you're balancing security and cost, because we don't necessarily always want to be that deep cost center. Sometimes we want to be able to do not sometimes, we always want to be able to do as much as possible with as little, whether that's money or people or rules, just generally, that's the idea.
Exactly.
But there's also different strategies or techniques you could use, like traffic sampling. So you can do, instead of using that sort of thing for all of your traffic, you can take specific random pieces of traffic and use those to kind of analyze and build your rule set off of that. And also would decrease the amount of traffic that's actually going into the proxy and actually decrease the amount of costs. That's based entirely off of your risk tolerance and what your target state strategy would be. So it's something you want to consider, but not necessarily just go, hey, they said we could do this and we could just traffic sample. Not if you're a financial institution or if you're, hosting an application with PII or something like that. So definitely depends on your circumstances and environment. And then, of course, there's, trade-offs between like regional WAFs versus a global WAF. And that can influence how you deploy, as well as you can adjust some of the rules to configure for cost or just regular capacity planning as well. So there's some definite things that you can do to be a little bit more cost effective or optimized for cost. That way, especially if the option is not having a WAF at all or having, a very cost optimized WAF, obviously that's going to be better than nothing that you that the alternative is. And then, coming back a little bit from that, how do we, test and validate those rules before we go off on our long journey, to go destroy the one rule. So there's definitely testing strategies and methodologies. You can create an entire test suite. You can even simulate attacks to see how your WAF would respond to those sorts of rules. So if you have a block for example, HTTP requests with a no user agent should be blocked. So I would go ahead and simulate an attack using no user agent and see if you're actually being blocked. And then there's obviously, like we were referring to earlier, there's strategies where you would start off in count mode and then kind of use those to more gradually roll out new rules. And then using that count mode data to analyze not only the effectiveness of your rules, but how often they're being used. If you have a heavy, expensive rule that may be slowing down or increasing the cost, if you've had count mode enabled and you haven't had any in the last 90 days, maybe you're not really optimizing your rule sets here. So there's a bunch of different other things that you can do to test for whether it's going to impact performance. You can look at like a false positive negative analysis to look to see which types of traffic and requests will pop those, or actually not pop any of the rules and still allow traffic to go underneath stealthily. So there's a bunch of different things that you can do, but you can also make sure that you have that safety net and provide those rollback procedures. So that way, if anything does go wrong or introduces impact on performance or whatever, you're quickly and safely rolling back to a known good state. So don't forget about that. It's important.
Have a good state. That's the important thing. And I think the other piece is, one, to your point, before it kind of pops out of my head, is you want to make sure that you understand your managed rules versus your custom rules. Because what if I were to use a visual, you don't want to be like, okay, let's see all of our rules in our organization, right? And you go through this whole thing. You ideally want to optimize that, especially when it comes to, hey, how do I handle the custom rules in the environment? Why is it important, right? Because when you think of your overall, I would say business logic, like what are your workflows with your applications and things of that nature, you're going to automatically be able to tailor it more with the custom rule sets, right? Because the managed rules, they're kind of tried and true, things that can be applied across the board, but you may need that last 15, 20% of, hey, I need something specific to my application workflow. And that's kind of where the custom rules come into play, right? So I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. And it also provides you with kind of an advantage when you think about it, because you're trying to cater to your environment. Your structure, your target state the best. Mm-hmm. So because of that, you can develop your rules in such a way that you understand how they're going to behave, how they're optimized, and ways that you can further improve upon, because it's a continuous cycle, right? Because everybody's running the tabletop exercise, hopefully. And within those tabletop exercises, you understand, okay, if this were to be detected or if this were to happen, we execute this plan. And if not, perfect times to think about what you're doing within your cloud security strategy. And the best way to think about that is you hear the different pieces of the puzzle, and Russ sees where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
Because you start to think about the legends in your own organization and externally. And here on the Safe Room Feature and Security Side Quest, we think about legends from a customer viewpoint or standpoint. So with a good old applause, we jump into another journey. So
before we do that, can we answer the question in the chat?
Yeah.
We do have a question about billing. So I just wanted to say, yes, WAF is billed by the number of rules, the number of ACLs, and the number of requests.
Yes.
So that's when we were talking about cost optimization. That's why we say, fewer rules, maybe the, less expensive ones up front. That's why we say that.
Yes.
So just wanted to interrupt to answer that real quick.
No, that is a good call out, because it plays right into kind of our theme for today in this side quest. It's almost like we plan out some of this stuff, right? So when we think about it, let's think of streaming, right? We'll go with a streaming platform, right? Because if you're let's say, streaming from Middle Earth or the streams of Middle Earth. That sounds like a good platform to go with. So we feel that maybe this organization has increasing attacks across their content delivery infrastructure. Now you think to yourself, hey, we have the basic mechanisms. We have some things that we're struggling with. So how exactly do we handle this? Right? Against bot attacks, because somebody mentioned it, content scraping, maybe, credential stuffing attempts. All these items come into play. So if we were to take this approach of understanding our fragmented approach to WAF security, now, how do we forge the one rule to protect them all? Because this is Middle Earth. So that is a good plan, policy, procedure. So in light of that, what we shall do is jump right to the side quest board. So for you first time joining, the side quest board is essentially a combination of customer story and us describing said customer story in a way that appeals to your senses. I would say of all 5, but we're working on that piece. So if you take a yeah, it's in the background. The taste, you can't taste the board. So as we're going through, we have a typical layout of, we have an authenticated user trying to access our AWS environment. And we have good old WAF here. We have the formulation of the approach that we have to take. So the problem that we see here is there's something sitting in between. And that something is a bunch of, let's say, unintended users that are trying to intercept said information. Maybe a group of bots, because we went down that path before. So if we were to understand our WAF defense, Russ, I pose this to you and Chad. If you were to name your ultimate WAF defense, what would you call the name of your WAF defense based on our Middle Earth analogies?
So based off of our analogies, especially because we're worried about our bots and bot traffic, I'm going to go with what you discussed earlier, the rate limiting, which when I look up in my Ultimate WAF Defense toolbook says that it is the Elven Gate.
Yes.
So I'm going to go with the Elven Gate as my
that is
my Ultimate WAF Defense.
Yes, that is a good name. And Pete N says Bigfoot needs to be used somewhere. Argonav. Yeah, little things like that. But if we say, hey, rate limited is the approach that we take, okay, now we're starting to get into the rhythm of understanding that we have multiple challenges that are faced by our streaming service or platform, the streams of Middle Earth. Now, how does WAF help these? Well, what are the challenges we're trying to solve for? We have a scattered defense strategy. We have a multi-realm region protection. We have the ancient rules to update. All these things, a dark traffic analysis. I can keep going with these analogies, but I think you're going with the path that we need to help understand, because when you think of WAF, we start to think of the different services and how do we apply the changes to this? Because, hey, I have WAF in the picture already. How do I optimize this? So if you were to deploy a WAF change to help block these intruders in our realm, how do we do so? Russ, I pose this question to you. How do you do this? How do you update?
Update our WAF changes?
Yes.
I would say using custom scripts, which in our case would be considered using the dark arts. So that's how I would use it. But I think another strong contender would be the Elvish magic, also known as cloud formation. So kind of using those cloud formation, the word is eluding me, but using that in order to ensure standardized changes for WAF.
Yes. And I would say, so if we're going down the custom scripting route, we have a couple of different mechanisms that we can use. So I will banish these personnel from our realm put down some step functions with a Lambda function and start to go through the route of not only IAC, but our custom scripts. Why? Because we know our application the best. So now that we have some custom scripting in place, we can start to go through understanding, hey, we're going to use the elvish magic of cloud formation. So to that appeal, we have our custom scripts, we have our IAC. Now, with that simple change, with this simple kind of tweak, you kind of see that we banished the people from our realm and started to go down the route of protecting our AWS environment just a little bit more. Because within all of this, we can forge the one WAF rule to rule it all and unite the realm of defenses. And what do I mean by that? I mean that you start to consider all the different pieces of the puzzle of your environment. Because when you start to think of how WAF can be leveraged, you start to think of, now if I have IAC, I can have automated updates rolled out throughout my environment. I can roll them out throughout my AWS organization and everything in between that. And you can start to build in mechanisms such as monitoring, right? So if we have something like CloudWatch to help understand our applications, we can start to refine our workflows. We can refine how things are being accessed, right? So all of these are pieces of the puzzle. But I know the question you have is, if we have one rule to rule them all, right? And disclaimer, you should have more than one rule. But if we use that methodology, because we're thinking of the optimized approach, and that's kind of where we're coming with the analogy today, is how do we test handling that rule? Russ, what is kind of the preferred methodology from you in order to test the rules?
So in order to test, I would say going with the two testing towers methodology, which is your test environment, but also known as Gandalf's Way. And I just want it to be known that Tristan makes these puns and writes them down for me so that way I can use them. But the Gandalf's Way, the test environment, I think that's going to be your number one place to go, attempt to simulate these attacks and see how your rules respond. Especially when you're making the custom rule set, that's your best way to be able to do that and verify, with evidence in front of your eyes, this will work.
Yes. And Russ does want to let you know that he's a big fan of a certain series, of a certain variety. So if we go down Gandalf's Way, the reason why I think that applies a little bit to a test environment is because if you don't follow this path while testing, you shall not pass, right? Over into higher level environments. Because it's very important to get everybody's buy-in on this, right? And where does the buy-in come from? Your overall security strategy of the target state kind. And Pete also brings up multiple great points of intelligent threat mitigation in WAF, and also calls out the article with it, because this is all part of the puzzle. So I think this deserves the good old pause game, Zach Moore's timeout, as we will call it, as we kind of take that step back and think about, hey, if we are going down this route of understanding, of knowledge, of trying not to get the sad music to play, we always have to decide what the ultimate route, the less preferred route. But part of this comes to, okay, how do we integrate WAF? Because we spoke about it kind of as a separate entity in a little bit, and then kind of went on from there. But there's key integration points that you have to have in your tool belt, right? Or your pouch, depending on where you're coming from. So CloudFront is a normal integration pattern, because when you think of CloudFront and the WAF integration capabilities, you start to think of, okay, globally, if I have WAF deployments, then I can have strategies that are optimized specifically to my workflow that help to protect against what we were talking about, the bot attacks and things of that nature, right? Cross-site scripting, all those good items. But it just doesn't stop there. CloudFront is one of the pieces. There's application load balancing that we mentioned, right? So you can match ALP regions with host header and X forwarders and things of that nature. But what you're trying to get to is, hey, in each one of these key service integrations, how does WAF come into play? So if I'm mentioning a service, you should have an understanding of why or why not you're using WAF. So CloudFront, ALBs, as I mentioned, API gateway is a big one, right? So there's a lot more, but the overall consistency or considerations, I should say, is that you want to ensure that you have protection and coverage across your estate or your environment or your realm. And the way to do that is to make sure that your entry points are covered. So when you start to go through, and thanks, Schizo, yes, Cognito as well, your authentication, is performing threat models. That's a simple exercise that I think you need to build up if you haven't done one regularly. The reason why is you start to think of all of these entry points into your organization. And by doing a threat model, you're able to kind of call out some of these different items. And you start to think about, okay, what are the regional aspects I have to consider? And what are the global aspects I have to consider? So when you have multiple regions and reasons for fallback configurations, to Russ's earlier point, you want to have all these items kind of mapped out, because the other piece, which is a whole nother episode, is DR and resiliency and all those kind of things. Because you have a distributed WAF deployment, then you want to have that to prevent single region failures. So there's a lot that goes into that. And there's ways to have some cost-efficient methodologies, right? So what I would say is, one, think about how to optimize your traffic flow, how to optimize your rule sets. But the other thing is to think of, hey, what else is out there? What are the common integration pitfalls that you may fall into? And I think that's an important place to kind of go, because people have walked this path before. Just like I says, hello, sometimes API gateway dissuades me an error like WAF error. I couldn't see the complete streaming. I'll watch a replay of it in the future. Yeah, I think this is an important part. So if you're running into particular type of errors, one of the things I always suggest is go into the logs and see what's happening and occurring up until that error. Because it may be displaying one item, but you want to read back and play back through the logs in order to understand, hey, was there something that expired, or was there something in place? Do you have permissions? Things of that nature, right? And as Pete says, search for the error. That's the other big thing is, hey, this pops up when I'm doing this item. That's an important consideration. And that's where testing also comes into play, by having your different tiers of environments, your dev, your UAT, your production. And as we said, the Gandalf way is you shall not pass from one stage to the other unless you iron out all these items and also say hello to Blessy. So, hello, Blessy. When we start to think about all these different items, you can kind of see how everything kind of stitches together in some cohesive way, even though it may seem out there. So the key piece of this is to try and pull things together in such a way that, hey, one, I understand my environment, and two, I understand my entry points. So now I can start to think about my outcomes. All those considerations. But I think one of the big considerations is false positives. That's a big, I would say, consideration. So we usually take a step back and think about it. But I think we also should have somewhat of a poll. So feel free to put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat to have the considerations. So, Russ, how do you handle false positives these days?
Yeah, so I think I've kind of already beaten the dead horse with testing and dev. So I'm going to go with the count mode first. I like to see how often these events or requests or whatever are actually occurring, to be able to show what I would like to do in the future. So whether that's, block more or allow more or loosen up or tighten up my rule set. So I like count mode first. As part of a bit of a, well, I'd say count mode first is a part of the gradual rule rollout. So I guess I'm just gonna take all of them. Apparently,
just take all of them. Just
Yeah.
I'll get one of everything. That's kind of the buffet approach, right? It's just
Yeah.
I'll take the the chicken, steak, and fish, and then swirl it together. But I think you bring up some important parts, right? You're testing out the rule first, like, hey, put it in count mode, see what happens. So, kind of a combination. So,
Yeah.
to your point,
If I could reorder these, they'd actually be a great setup. We
It's a
test in
process.
dev first, then we use count mode, and then use that to gradually roll out the rule. And anything we do, we will accept some risk because we're putting it on the internet.
Yes, and we have some questions from Pratik saying, can we externalize ASM logs to any other observability solutions so that ML can be applied based on threat? So the interesting thing is there's a couple of different ways to go about this, and it would be a cool solution to think about because you can essentially take something like WAF, use maybe Kinesis data firehose to S3 in order to figure out a couple of things and start to get into a workflow in order to maybe apply some type of priority order. What I mean by priority is like, okay, if I'm going to send this to maybe a SIM or some third-party tool, now you can apply some logic to it in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can have that just dumped directly into, let's say, a Splunk or a Datadog or something along those lines. So there's a couple different ways to go about it. So thank you for that question. And yes, as Pete says, maybe in the future, WAF will feed AWS Security Hub. Yeah. And is this an actual live stream? Yes, we are live in person. So thank you for asking. And how long does this take? Well, 1 hour. So like and subscribe every Monday, 11 a.m. PST time. So thank you for joining in. So going down this route, I would add one other piece of this puzzle. AWS attempting to create a SIM. So there's different ways to think about it where you can optimize your logging approaches. So I think we'll double click into this for a second, all right? So you have all these logs in your environment. If you have an AWS control tower set up, especially with a centralized logging archive account, now you can start to do some things. You can have a centralized logging source where you have something like a security lake, or if you just want to go with S3, and then all that logic I was speaking about, you can start to implement in such a way that you can take it and maybe prioritize it and then go to another source, right? Like another third-party SIM, to your point. Or you can start to implement some workflow logic and some step functions and so on and so forth. So there's ways to go about it. But I think part of that is, one, understanding your target state security strategy. And the other piece of that is understanding what outcome are you trying to do? Are you trying to have, to your point, where, hey, I want to see more native AWS solutions. That's a great point. And third-party solutions may be overpriced. But the other piece of that is, are you optimizing? I think that was one of the reoccurring themes that we kind of were coming up with is, are you optimizing the logs that you're sending, right? Because are you sending critical, high, medium, and low all to the SIM? Or are you only sending critical and high and then leveraging some type of analytical solution in order to capture the medium and low for investigation, maybe using native tool sets like Athena and Glue kind of situation? So all important pieces of the puzzle. The way you start to think about all these different tools is, one, understanding the different tools. And the way to do that is understanding some of the certificate knowledge that comes into play. And what do I mean by that? Well, essentially, one, if we take that step back, is what would a service like Security Hub do versus Athena versus Glue? But if we're trying to focus on specifically some of the knowledge that we learned this episode, we were going on a knowledge quest. And is that quest a long one? Maybe. No spoilers. But essentially what we're trying to get to is an understanding of one, a service like WAF and how it can be implemented and matured within your infrastructure. The second part of that is getting to a place where, hey, do I know the basics of what forms something like a network perimeter, a data perimeter? And why is that important? Well, when you're starting to think about your overall structure, you start to think of, if I understand something like my network perimeter, now I can get to a point of saying, hey, if I have something like generative AI baked in, now I can do a couple of things as I expand upon that. And here we like to divide this into some levels. What are those levels approach? Well, one, it would be the defense rookie. You're starting to understand how WAF is structured within your environment. And in this case, you just have regular API gateway, Lambda function, and Bedrock, right? It's simple. But remember something. We were talking about WAF and how it integrates with API gateway. So now, if we're starting to cook with helium or hydrogen, as one of my professors used to say, you're starting to think about how this can be affected within, or how this can affect your environment overall. So now you dig into it a little bit more. You say, hey, how do I tune my AWS WAF? How do I get to a point of understanding how do I manage multiple WAFs or shields and things of that nature with something like Firewall Manager? And eventually you start to get to a point where you become a counter specialist. And we're going through this quickly for the reason of, one, we want you to kind of reach out and let us know how you go on these type of pieces we call knowledge quests. Mm-hmm. And two, we're running out of time. But three, I would say, as we start to go through these different areas, you start to figure out the reoccurring pattern is, how do I mature? How do I understand defense? And how do I become a counter specialist? So that if I have WAF within my environment, I understand the workflow. I understand my rule sets. I understand where I'm supposed to go. So eventually, I can level up and become what we were meant to be, Web Guardian Legends. And what do legends get? Well, you get some type of plaque, maybe. But I just always like to think of a plaque, right?
As a legend will bow to no one.
Yes. So when your knowledge exceeds a certain amount of experience points, because you built so much aura through a knowledge quest, and eventually you start to think about knowledge quests in a way that, hey, I can challenge these different assumptions within my, let's say, organizational structure. What I mean by that is, are we secure as one of our common outcomes? Because that is our top priority, right? So the key to that is, one, do you feel like you could enter a knowledge quest WAF tournament arc? And we say tournament arc because every good anime likes to have a tournament arc. But we also say this in jest for the reason of, hey, every step that you take helps to build some experience up. And each experience point helps you to level up not only your, let's say, your defenses, but your overall knowledge. So when we have questions like Pratik on what hardware AWS WAF is built upon, does it have a chassis model for scalability? I know quite of out-of-box question, but curiosity. So places you find us is in the knowledge quest. I would start answering some of these questions by going to the WAF documentation page and kind of delving in, because there's a lot of backend to the WAF and there's a lot of secret sauce when it comes to AWS, but there are different ways to go about certain things, right? And the last question, as we were running out of time, I've done a hobby project, Selfie Insider Threat, agentic AI using LLMs from AWS Bedrock. This kind of maps to the MITRE ATT&CK. So all these kind of things, I would say, save for next week. Come back, Blessy, and we can talk about this a little bit more because it's interesting.
Yeah.
But until then, Russ has something that's also interesting and maybe appealing to you.
Yeah. Please create an incident response plan.
Yes.
Before you.
Exactly. And with that final note, thank you for joining us today. And until next time, have a great one. Keep on side questing. Keep having fun.